Take just a moment, if you would, and count the number of squares in this diagram. Probably a lot of you got 16 right off the bat, and then you thought, oh no, there are more than 16 squares up there. And in fact, when I give this puzzle, I typically hear 16, 17, 25, 28, sometimes more squares, which is pretty extraordinary given the fact that we're all looking at the same relatively simple chart. In fact, the answer is 30. By the time you count those 16 squares, the 9 2x2 block squares, the 4 3x3 block squares, and the 1 big square. And what I think this exercise illustrates is once the human brain has arrived at a conclusion, once it knows something, once it assumes something, it kind of shuts down and it moves on to the next problem to be solved. We're all looking at the same thing, but we're getting different answers because we're failing to dive below the surface. Assumptions. And for those of us in education, I think there are a lot of assumptions about teaching and learning. Oddly enough, a lot of learning takes place without any teaching having taken place at all. By the same token, there are a lot of activities that appear to be teaching, in which case I'm sure that no learning has happened. We could probably make a list of successful outcomes for non-teaching professionals. Doctors cure colds, and housekeepers clean up messes, and lawyers win trials. But how do we know if a teacher is doing her or his job? It's a little more complex, isn't it? Stop by any school, and you'll probably visit with teachers and students that appear to be in lots of different kinds of activities that appear to be teaching and learning. You might come to a lecture hall like this one where there's an adult speaking and students taking notes. Maybe you'll drop by the orchestra room and there's a conductor gesturing and there are musicians playing music back at them. Perhaps you'll go to a smaller seminar room where students are seated in a circle and they're being led in discussion. And then you'd report back that you visited this school and you observed teaching and learning and action. But how do we know that learning was really happening? Well, the teachers were doing very teacherly things. They were talking and explaining. And the students were doing things that students do. They were being somewhat attentive and following directions mostly, and they were raising their hands and offering answers. But were they really learning? Is one of the criterion for learning the student appeared to be somewhat attentive while sitting in class? Most of us spend 18 to 22 years of the front part of our lives as students, and so how hard can this teaching thing really be? Never mind that we really wouldn't expect an individual to fly an airplane based on the fact that they'd taken a lot of flights. But go to Ellen's class, and obviously she's teaching because she's talking about math, and she's writing equations on the board. And go to Chris's classroom, and the students are obviously learning because they're taking notes and they're raising their hands. Assumptions. A lot of us, from nursery school teachers to professors at the elite colleges and universities in the country, define teaching and learning based on these very shaky assumptions. And what I want to suggest to you is that through clarity of language and intention, and by borrowing a few techniques from our friends in the music education profession, that we can come to think about teaching and learning in new and hopefully more helpful ways. The goal of teaching, I would argue, is to cause some sort of positive transformational change in students. I think this is reasonably obvious. But what's not obvious is how we determine that we've actually made that change, especially if we've been unclear about how we are checking to see if the students learn what we actually want them to learn. Course objectives in class syllabi often include this combination of the acquisition of knowledge, or things that we know, and the development of skills, the things that we know how to do. The fancy terms for these are declarative knowledge and procedural knowledge. And many of us spend our student careers obsessed with cultivating declarative knowledge, or stuff that we know. I had a friend in graduate school who was completing his doctorate in violin performance. He was at his final defense, and the faculty was lined up Inquisition style, and they're firing questions at it. And so the first professor asks, name Beethoven's birth and death dates. Doctoral exam. The second professor asked, what are the keys of the Beethoven violin sonatas? Doctoral exam. And the third professor, one of my favorite music teachers of all time, Austin Caswell, asked, what is the function of music in culture? And my poor friend, the blood drained from his face and he was stammering around trying to answer the question, which he did not adequately. And after the defense, one of the violin teachers went up to Dr. Caswell and said, you know, Austin, I see what you're trying to do. You're trying to get him to think. Many of us are familiar with this great American tradition of stuffing our short-term memories with content. We have become test-taking ninjas, and we're able to memorize vast amounts of information, temporarily, that can easily be recalled on exams, facts and figures, and dates, and vocabulary terms. I know that mitochondria are the centers for cellular respiration. I know that John Williams composed the soundtrack to Star Wars in 1977. I know that a haiku is a 3-line Japanese poem with syllabic structures of 5, 7, and 5. Declarative knowledge. And how is it that we're teaching declarative knowledge? Well, recent research suggests that about 50% of all STEM courses in colleges in the United States are being taught in an all-lecture format. And another 25 to 30% of those are being taught in a mostly lecture format with some interactive components. Which begs the question, if you're teaching in all lecture or mostly lecture formats, how exactly is it that you're trying to make some kind of positive transformational change in your students? Now, having said that, I acknowledge that lecture does have a place in teaching, but maybe not as the center point of information delivery. Still, in a lot of our memories, that's kind of the way that we learn the stuff that we know. Demonstrating that you know how to do things and then teaching that is a whole other can of worms, isn't it? And it's not always easily articulated by those who are good at it. I'm really good at tying my tie, but I'm not sure I could teach you how to do that at this very moment. What I want to suggest to you is that expertise in any discipline is not predicated on what you know, but it's on what you're able to do. Knowing the periodic table of elements does not make you a good chemist. Knowing that the Louisiana Purchase happened in 1803 does not make you an effective historian. If I wanted to teach you to play saxophone, I could try giving you a book about saxophone, or I could play recordings of saxophone music, or I could show you videos of saxophone players. I could play my saxophone for you. Would you be able to play the saxophone? No. What would solve the problem? You playing saxophone. Now, I'm not arguing that content is unimportant, but I think a lot of us have assumptions about the nature of expertise in our fields that's based solely on knowing things. Things that are easily forgotten by students after they're tested on them. And content is available in cell phones and on watches nowadays. But skill development requires intentional cultivation. One of the reasons I love teaching music is that I think it serves as a model for all skills-based classes, which in my opinion should be all classes. There's a lot to know about music, but there's a whole lot more to do. The purpose of music education is to teach students to do the things that good musicians do. And the manifestation of good music instruction is, well, good music. And it streamlines the entire teaching operation because the educational objectives and the instructional strategies and the assessment and evaluation are all identical. Good music. And from a neuroanatomical point of view, the brain loves music. When students are involved in playing and singing and dancing and listening to music, the brain is firing on all cylinders. There's no really central processing unit of music in the brain, but instead all of the elements of music are perceived by the brain and acted upon them in different parts all at the same time. So critical listening comes in through the temporal lobe and the auditory cortex, and bodily movements and physical manifestations of music come in through the cerebellum and the motor cortex and all of the sensory cortices. Emotional reactions to music happen in the nucleus accumbens and the amygdala, and musical memories and experiences are stored in the hippocampus. And the prefrontal cortex is coordinating social interaction and quick decision-making and aesthetic judgments. The brain loves music. And music wraps itself around all of the major learning domains: the cognitive, intellectual thinking part, the psychomotor, kinesthetic moving part, and the affective, spiritual, emotional feeling part that coalesce to create musical artistry. And music and all of the performing and visual arts illustrate, as they always have, the fundamentals of practice and habit strength and grit, which are central to cultivating competence and mastery and expertise and are applicable to any academic area. Music is about listening and thinking and feeling and moving and doing. And it focuses on the individual mastery, small group interactions, and large ensemble interdependence, kind of like school and work and life. And another really beautiful vision of music as a model for teaching skills-based education is that we have tons of opportunities for low-stakes assessments. Music teachers give 200 or 300 forms of feedback and assessment and an evaluation in a single class, which beats that class we all took back in college where the professor gave us a midterm and a final and then we got a grade to reflect how much we learned. And so my challenge to you, future teachers, current teachers, is to throw away those yellow crusty lecture notes, purge some of those assumptions that you have about teaching and learning, and take a music teacher to lunch. We all have assumptions about teaching and learning that may not be serving us well. And if you unpack those and rearrange them and weigh how much you emphasize what you know versus what you do, you may find some more space for some highly effective instruction and some real meaningful learning experiences. And I hope that someday you're able to visit Paris and that you'll be able to see Paris in the dark. And that when you're packing for this trip, you won't need that extra "the." Because you know what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get you to think.